So I recently got my Agile change management certification, and I am timing myself too. And there's so much that can be shared on this topic, but I thought I would stick to what makes Agile change management different than other change management approaches, and then talk about one of the most valuable tools in the Agile change management toolkit, which is the roadmap, and then take any questions that you guys might have. So what Agile takes into account is that for every change initiative or project, there's two types of change. There's tangible change, which is the actual things that are changing. So these could be new systems, new software, new location for an office, but also behavioral change. And this, as OD people, we all know, is the psychological and emotional process that people go through when they're required to try out new ways of working, or report to a new location, or use a new paperless software, which is the use case I'll be referring to. So the tangible is the new stuff that's changing, and the behavioral is the new way of working. And Agile is highly collaborative, which is probably why I love it, in that it takes these two types of change together. And early in the process, Agile gets the people that are responsible for creating the change together with the people that are expected to try out the new ways of working and implement the change. So this is different and a more collaborative approach than traditional approaches, because traditional change, and when I say traditional, I'm referring to like not an agile approach, like a waterfall approach to change, where all of the new processes get planned out early and the new systems get built, but then at the end state, everything is handed to the users that are expected to do it and use it. And what can happen, and a lot of times does happen, is that those that are impacted by the change don't get a say early enough in how the change gets implemented. So this can result in change fatigue and a lot more resistance. And it can also be really difficult to plan, because as we all know, what we plan for today, 6 months from now, could be obsolete or irrelevant by then. So Agile starts with a conversation in the beginning with all of the stakeholders about the end goal. So what's the transformation we're trying to get to? And then instead of planning out everything that's going to happen along the way, Agile takes the end goal and breaks it into individual components. New ways of working are adopted piece by piece. So in Agile change, the important thing to note here is just that the end goal is known, but the how we're going to get there is left a little bit fluid, and it gets decided and reprioritized along the way. So I like to compare it to putting an address in your navigation and not freaking out if you have to reroute because there's a traffic jam. Which brings us to the roadmap. So by far, this is the most valuable tool in the Agile toolkit for a lot of reasons. And there's actually more components to the roadmap than what I'm showing here, but these are the three core elements. So the time frame is fixed. That's dependent on what the business need is. So even though Agile is iterative, it still takes into account that there's a deadline for the goal. The roadmap gets created in the planning stage, which is in iteration 1. And the most important thing in iteration 1, and if I knew how to use the zoom pointer, I would. Here, maybe I can annotate. The most important thing in iteration 1 is that we come out of it with a high-level plan and a scope. And by scope, I mean it's clear what's included in the change and what's not included in the change, but that everybody understands what it's going to be. So it's not just the developers that have to write the code, it's also the end users that have to use the new product. So the roadmap gets built out in iteration 1, the scope gets defined, and then the magic happens. At the end of iteration 1, now that you've got this high-level scope defined, the big question that Agile asks is, of the end goal, what piece can we take and implement and try and prototype early that will give us the highest business value outcome, right? So instead of just saying we're going to move to a paperless software system, for example, we'd say we're going to move to a paperless software system, but for iteration 2, we're going to pilot some piece of it with a core team that will be most affected by being paperless in the end. So Agile looks at where you're going to get the most lift and tries to prototype there early. And the end result there is that you get this situation where you've got the early adopters identified early, for one. So you're starting to build your coalition, like Cotter talks about building your coalition, building short-term wins. Agile makes sure that at the end of each iteration, there's both a behavioral change as well as the tangible change. And then it basically, you just wash, rinse, and repeat. So you get through an iteration and you say, okay, what did we learn? What do we want to apply? How do we prioritize the next iteration? And you continue that process until you get to the end goal. But you're constantly asking what's going to bring the highest value outcome, and you're also incorporating the feedback early as opposed to later. The other thing I love about the roadmap, and I'm almost done and I'm at 7 minutes, so is that I feel like it's super user friendly. Like you could give a roadmap to anybody. You don't have to have your PMP certification. I was able to make a roadmap on a PowerPoint for a project that I'm working on. And it's something that is easy for everybody to look at and understand and say, okay, when we get to this point, here's what's expected of me. So I like to say that Agile is very accessible. Now I'm having trouble with my annotation tool. I tried to be fancy. There we go. So it's a highly collaborative approach. So just to recap, it takes into account the tangible and the behavioral change. It's iterative in that it happens in pieces that could be called sprints. People use different terms for them, sprints or iterations. And most importantly, it's a blended approach that takes the stakeholders that are making the change as well as the stakeholders that are experiencing the change into account the whole way through the change process. And it's also highly accessible. It can be applied in any industry. We talked about in the group that I studied in, we talked about how it could be applied to people that are working in diamond mines or people that are working in a paperless software environment. So that is all I have to say on that. I've got some extra slides here with a link to my site and my LinkedIn page. And then there's also links here that I'll share out if anybody's interested in resources or wants to talk more about the Agile Change Management certification. I'm happy to answer your questions.